Tramuta to Après, Midi. She's really here. How should I say this? I'm not going to say anything because she wasn't feeling well earlier. So we're really glad she's here.
Holding it together.
She's holding it. She's smiling. She's holding it together. Okay, Lindsey, we've all seen her like on France 24 and all the various amazing, wonderful things. I just saw an article that you're in the New York Times that you're one of the authors of. I was just reading that. She is a bilingual French-English culture and travel journalist, best-selling author, podcaster, and editorial consultant. Since 2012, her work has appeared in the New York Times Style magazine, the New York Times, Condé Nast Traveler, Fortune magazine, Afar magazine, Travel and Leisure, Eater, and Vogue, among other international publications. Not bad, girl. It's a hell of a list. Okay. Based in Paris for over 15 years, she's the author of the best-selling book, The New Paris, The People, Places, and Ideas Fueling a Movement, and The New Parisienne, The Women and Ideas Shaping Paris. While not traveling across Europe, Lebanon, Botswana, and the U.S. to report stories, Lindsey can usually be found drinking coffee and curling up with a book alongside her husband and her 2 cats.
Mostly the cats.
I will not tell him you said that, although it's been recorded. Okay, on that note, Lindsey Tramuta.
Thank you so much for coming on a Tuesday afternoon and being curious. I get the sense that Adrian has kind of cultivated a tremendous following of curious people and who love living here and love France. So I thought I would start by just giving you maybe just a little bit of background on how I got here, because I think everyone's story is slightly different, and I think there's an assumption that everyone was a Francophile from the time they were born, and that's how they ended up. But my story was a little bit different. I sort of, because I didn't want to follow in my older sister's footsteps, I chose to study French. She chose Spanish in middle school, and sort of that was the moment, the sort of decisive moment where I said, I'm gonna chart my own path, never thinking this would come to anything. I'm just gonna follow language to the minimum requirements and then see. But it turns out where I really struggled in school was in math and science, but the languages were sort of my happy place. And actually I sort of discovered a different side of myself when learning French. And so I continued, went to college. I ended up graduating from Temple University and majoring in French literature and linguistics. And I realized at that time that there was something that studying language in this way was opening up to me. But at that point I wasn't, I'm from Philadelphia, by the way, in case I realized, I love that there's at least one.
No Eagles.
Right. Unfortunately, but yes, they did okay.
Pennsylvania's in here?
So, I didn't grow up in a family where, traveling internationally was very, very much priority. It was, you do well in school, you try to figure out your life, and I have family in medicine, and here I was struggling in biology and math and chemistry, and they sort of knew, this is not going to be her journey. So, I think growing up in a family with people who are interested in those things, you sort of come out of the gate and say, I'm interested in French linguistics and history, and they're like, who are you? What's happening here? So either way, I sort of followed it as far as I could, and realized that people ask me now if I was sort of under some spell, when it comes to Paris and other parts of France. But I really was so focused on literature and language and trying to become sort of this fluent human being in this language that I have literally no familial attachment to, right? I mean, half of our family is Italian. I mean, I should have gone in different directions, but I didn't. And
can you take the test for me?
If I could, I would. But I think so. The question now comes up often. Did you buy into a lot of the cultural tropes around France and around Paris? Did you were you just sort of obsessed with the culture? But actually, for me, the culture, yes, you could say language is culture, but that all came secondary. So I arrived in Paris studying for a summer in 2006, and then was back by the end of that year and never left, essentially. So I ended up going to grad school at the American University of Paris to study communication, because at that point I knew I needed to, I'm sure those of you who have spent a lot of time living in France, you know sort of how to get a job, or at least if you have children who have gone this route, you know the internship is sort of like the obligatory rite of passage in this country. So if that was my goal, which it was to stay indefinitely, you needed to sort of get in that kind of way. So I did that. I was, I interned in branding and advertising, and I worked in advertising for a time, and that's when I started writing. I had a blog. We call them blogs now, and it seems almost like an amusing term, because blogs
They used to be called newsletters.
Well, now they're newsletters. No, like now they're newsletters.
They've gone back to newsletters?
Now it's back to newsletters. You send
Glad
these
to
email
hear
updates, but they're effectively blogs. But I had a site, it still exists, I just don't update it, called Lost in Cheeseland, which was really just silly. I mean, it was a name. I created this in 2009. I was trying to figure out my life. I was working in a job just for a few months, replacing someone, trying to figure out where I was going, And this was, of course, when you're trying to find a job during the economic crisis, one of, or at least the biggest one we can recall of the last, 10 years, and no one was hiring. So it's like figuring out how I was going to fashion a career, manufacture a career for myself. And while I was eventually finding my way in advertising and working as a social media strategist and writer within sort of those kinds of structures, I started really picking up steam with my own website and started pitching stories a bit outside of my website. So, realizing that there were some things that didn't seem right for my audience, but were appropriate for maybe the New York Times or any of these outlets that cover Paris with great hunger, because as I'm sure you all know, people can't seem to get enough of stories about Paris, or whatever they are, whether it's food related or there's a cultural event or whatever. And so I had someone who really mentored me and gave me the name of a contact, and I sent off my first pitch, not knowing how to even do that properly, and then that was sort of it, and I started writing regularly for T Magazine, which is the style supplement of the New York Times, but getting to do lots of things I never thought I would get to do, going deep into culture and food and beyond Paris as well. And but in terms of how I was seeing Paris, I didn't come from this romanticized version of the city. At least that wasn't how I was sort of my French education reared me. But I land here, and of course I see all of the things that we know to be true. We're sort of bombarded with images and advertisements and representations now on social media of a certain version of Paris.
You mean like Emily in Paris?
If we're going back 10, 15 years, it's essentially that, but just whatever that was 10 to 15 years ago. But even in terms of some of the stories that editors would ask me and some of my fellow writers to work on, we were sort of like, there's a disconnect here between what we're living. I live in the 11th arrondissement, which was pure happenstance. I mean, you could say that, you chose the hipster part of town, but actually that's where my husband was living back before anyone cared about the 11th arrondissement. He picked it because he could afford it, almost 20 years ago. And so I land there, and I start seeing sort of all of these pretty incredible shifts happen in the eastern part of Paris. Not only the eastern part of Paris, but certainly many of them due to cost, following the economic crisis, where people sort of completely upended their careers and chose to start their own businesses or do radically different things, and start sort of documenting and following what was happening in the city and how that was a pivotal moment in how the city was going to evolve from there. So both in terms of people working in business and starting companies, but also in terms of urban design and how the city was going to sort of adjust to all of these new pressures, whether they were economic or environmental. Obviously that's a more recent urgency. But so in any case, I was always sort of struck by what the outside world seemed to constantly want to consume about Paris, and what I was experiencing on the ground, which seemed to be so much more dynamic and interesting and
polished, but in a good way, in a way that highlighted that this is a living, breathing city with all sorts of problems and, you know, ambitions, and maybe some of them they can't achieve, but there's this desire to really push Paris to be something that, you know, it maybe hadn't given itself the opportunity. Because I think in some ways, France as a whole is so attached to its heritage. How could it not be? I would say Italy is also, you know, one of the other Western European countries that probably struggles to shake off this, you know, postcard image that people have. I mean, in the collective imagination, these places are meant to be what we've been shown in films, in books, you know, this sort of thing. But I think that what makes Paris so interesting is the fact that it is evolving, even if people are having trouble with that tension or feel a tension with that evolution. So that's sort of what I started to try to focus on in my work. Before the books, it was just sort of, okay, well, who's responsible for bringing things forward, working on what it means to be a person in Paris? What does it mean to, what will Paris look like in the future? And then I realized that through new book releases, that story was still not being told in a collective way. There were maybe some cookbooks that were looking at, you know, the changing dining space or the way people were consuming food, or, you know, but nothing that was really trying to get at, even from a sociological perspective, what is going on here. And that's where I put together a proposal, having never done something like that, and said, I think there's something here. And that became the New Paris, which was not to say, I mean, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. I'm, you know, in the beginning I was kind of forever having to explain the name, but it was meant to be a bit cheeky, as to say, you know, Paris actually has oftentimes in its history been considered super progressive. If you think about the Pont Neuf, the bridge in the center of the city, they were the first in Europe to have a bridge, to have sidewalks. I mean, this is a city that has always been quite innovative. And then what happened along the way? At what point did they sort of coast on their accolades and their successes, and, you know, let other parts of the world take over and become sort of the ones we turn to when we think of inventive and creative food, urban design, all of these things. So at some point, you know, Paris really was at the forefront of everything, and I sort of wanted to highlight that it is still working toward that, and I think it operates at a different pace than other cities. People love to compare parts of Paris or all of Paris to other global capitals, but I don't really think that's a fair comparison when you think of the culture here and versus other places, and what motivates people. What is the working culture like? Are they really operating on the same time frame? No. So, I mean, I think once you look at Paris as its own, you know, following its own drumbeat, and, you know, working and advancing and adapting in its own way, you know, you see that it just had to follow its own path, and it takes time. So I was happy to see that actually now, you know, this book came out in 2017, and you look now and you see what's happened in the city since COVID, with all of the bike lanes and all of the you know, the urban renewal and overhaul, some of which, you know, is a source of tension as well. And I think that's the other thing to keep in mind, is that Paris as the city that everyone loves and dreams of, and you know, with such a dense population, obviously not every measure is going to be successful, but it feels like what I was motivated by is now constant. It's not every so often there's something new happening or something developing, but it seems to be the regular pace of life now. Again, for better or for worse. There are some things that I would love to see happen that haven't happened, and other things that, you know, are going full steam ahead.
Who do you think's responsible for that?
Well, there are a lot of people. I think, you know, obviously the mayor has had her, you know, the socialists have been in power from a mayoral perspective
For a long
at
time.
least for at least over 15, 20 years. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's, you know, that's part of it. But there are local initiatives. There are people trying to do things, and certainly the circumstance, specifically the economic context back, you know, in 2008, 2009, really changed some things for people. I mean, when we talk about, and I remember the reports at the time of people, you know, doing reconversion and shifting their careers because they literally had to. You know, we like to think of France as the place where everyone wants to stay in the same company for their entire career and have that safety, but that safety proved not so stable during that moment. And so, I mean, my husband actually is someone who is in the same company since I've known him, changing positions, but it's less and less common now. And I think that was a key moment where people were like, all right, time to follow something, pursue something else, and maybe something with more meaning. The number of examples of people who left finance to work in baking or, start a soap business or, whatever. It's just kind of astounding. And that tells you something maybe about how people are culturally forced into this, to make these decisions too early on, which we know is true, right? The middle schoolers are basically trying to chart their whole careers in this country when they don't even know what they're good at. And I think that leads to this moment of, what am I doing? But we've benefited from that moment in a way. There's a lot of very interesting projects and people who are really committed to making this city better. So after that book, I thought, okay, I did it. It's done. Maybe people will pick up on this and realize that they need to frame the city in a different way. But no, we keep seeing, and this is again still way before Emily in Paris, which I apologize if anybody really has deep affection for that show because I'm always on this soapbox of
we all are, dear.
Well, but but even before that though, it was magazines still for every story that paints the city and its people in a good light or in a more representative or realistic light, there are 10 to 20 others that are rehashing the same story. And you might say, well, who cares? Paris does just fine regardless. But I think it actually, and that's what leads into this second book, I think that actually removes some of the humanity from this place. I think we expect it to be one thing and it's not, but that's because the expectations were incorrect or imbalanced or just not fair to the people who are trying to, make this a fantastic city to live and visit, but, can't control the narrative that gets pushed out by travel agencies and media and film, and of course Emily in Paris isn't the only example of this, but it's certainly the most egregious today. And so the other element of when I'm thinking of well, okay, how do we take this idea of trying to do Paris justice? Well, who else is affected by sort of these myths and these ideas? Well, it's women. I don't really know, maybe some Italian women, but again, I think it's hard. Again, it's hard to compare, but I feel like there's really no other female as fetishized as the Parisian woman. And so I was trying to understand, why are we still doing this? Why are we still writing articles about, how to do everything like
fetishized? That's a great word.
But I mean, that's what's happening, and the way that not even just women's magazines, but newspapers will fall into this trap, how they will paint women and also the characteristics of them that always sort of repeat. They're always white, they're always thin, they're always pretty affluent, they're almost always heterosexual, they're always able-bodied. I mean, and when you look around this city,
you're going where are they?
Well, they exist, of course, but it's what we would call, and for those of you who know the work of Chimamanda, she would say this is the sort of the plight of the single story. It's not that it's untrue, it's that it's a partial truth, and what happens is who that story excludes. So it excludes too many people. And and I'm sure all of you have had, if you live here permanent, you've had people come visit. Maybe you've heard comments like, I didn't realize this city was so diverse and that they don't all look one way. And it's like, are you kidding? But this is the result of certain depictions in popular media, in popular culture. And so I said to myself, what is behind this? When did this start even? Because we could look at, just women's magazines, but it goes so much deeper. And so that's what I try to do with this book. I look at initially sort of what is the foundation of this myth and who does it benefit to keep it alive, because it in fact says a lot about who the French government also wants to be considered French or Parisian. Who it benefits in terms of brands, because obviously this is an idea that makes billions of dollars for companies, many of whom are French. If we think about the big corporations that capitalize on the image of the Parisian woman, whether it's the group LVMH or their competitors, beauty brands, et cetera, I mean, it's all sort of wrapped up in the same the same goal of selling an image and an attitude and series of ideas. And then I wanted to put forward a variety of women who are very much tied to this place, very much working to influence it in some way, either through their activism, through their writing, through their businesses, and who may not actually be French. Maybe they're actually from other parts of the world and have lived here a long time. Maybe some of them are from the suburbs, because as we know, there's a psychological barrier for a lot of the locals who grew up on the other side of the périph', on the other side of the périphérique, which you would assume is some, like far off land, but actually it's just this mental, mental barrier. And but there were a number of women I spoke to for this book who really felt like, when I grow up, I'm going to live in Paris, because that is making it. I will have left this side of the périph' as though it's, climbing Everest to get over it, or to be considered someone with greater status because they no longer live in the suburbs. So whatever their background, sort of saying there are women who are making this city incredible, and not just in the political space, although Mayor Hidalgo is in the book, because whether you like her or hate her.
You can't ignore her.
You can't. No. And I think she's an example of someone who, again, like her or hate her, she, being a woman in politics, almost anywhere, comes with a barrage of hate just by default. And so what it's like having to, when you look at what that means, what she tries to push through, would that have, bristled so many people had it been initiated by a man? I don't know. So anyway, these kinds of questions, you look at, what does it take to succeed in Paris today and create and develop as a woman in Paris? And so that's what I was hoping to do. And this came out in 2020, which was obviously the worst time to bring out anything into the world, but I've been happy that it's found people and it's resonated. And I know that we need more stories like this, because not only Emily in Paris, right? We know that,
the cliches,
yeah. But we still, just 2 weeks ago, I saw another article by Australian Vogue, not saying they're the prime example of quality reporting, but still said like how to do your hair now like the French girls. First of all, we're always conflating French girls and Parisian women, which is not the same. And I think anyone from Marseille would probably tell you that they don't want to be lumped into that. But that actually, from as a historical anecdote, that actually comes from around the World Expo in 1900. Paris was the epicenter of French life, culture, economy, art. And so usually when you would talk about the French woman, you were talking about the Parisian woman. And so in literature and in media at that time, you sort of start seeing that association, but it never changed. And so now all these articles are just French girl, French girl, French girl does this, French girl wears her lipstick like this. I mean, it's just so reductive. And it continues. So my point is, for every women's magazine that was willing to talk about this angle, and also they look at it as just an angle, and that they're not actually complicit in perpetuating these myths and these stereotypes, they're like, yes, you're right, we should cover something like this, and then go right back to the clickbaity kind of stories. So I just think that there's more to be done, and I think that, does it mean that the woman who the Inès de la Fressange doesn't exist? She exists, but is she the majority? And I think that's the question to, that I ask people to pay attention to when you're walking around. Who is being erased from the story of who is and isn't a Parisian? And so that leads me to today, where I keep telling stories and keep trying to combat stereotypes when I see them, because I think they're actually more harmful. Again, people might say, well, who cares? Paris is going to be fine. It's like, yeah, but there's a huge population in Paris who actually struggle with these things day in and day out. And I think that comes through some of the stories, the people who really struggled, who were born here but never saw themselves represented in any way, and what that does over time. And I think Paris does have a lot it could offer, but there are some issues that need tackling. So there's also a primer in the book that looks at, what are some of these big issues, whether it's, the feminist topics, whether it's, racism and discrimination, how they handle secularism, and all of the things that are sort of the through line through these women's experiences. But, if I can say anything about the last 3 years, is that I think we're far more vocal and talking about the changing city, whether we like it or dislike it, but are more open to having these discussions and conversations. And sometimes they get heated, but at least we're having them.
Women or everyone?
Everyone. I mean, obviously we're talking about retirement right now, but we're also still talking about women's issues because I'm going to butcher the Haut Conseil, do you know what it is about the égalité entre femmes et... There was a report published just like 3 weeks ago that found statistically that women are still being sexually harassed and assaulted in France, and the numbers are actually going up. And so there's a big debate about, well, what does that say about what the feminists have been trying to do? And it's like, well, actually it just shows that, we're talking about it and there's more work to be done, but that there's still problems, and how do we tackle those? Well, it has to go to education. So anyway, whether it's these themes or how the city's preparing for the Olympics next year, which I think is going to be chaos, but I hope maybe you're more optimistic than I am. I was just near Gare du...
I'm leaving.
Well, that's the other thing people are going to do. Gare du Nord is under construction because they're preparing for that, and most of the games are actually going to be in the northern part of Paris or in Saint-Denis. And so now there are also issues of, okay, well, are they going to do better than other cities in making sure these, it really involves the local population and
probably not.
Sustainably, like far after the games. So anyway, there are lots of issues that we can be thinking about when it comes to this city and the people living in it and what it means for the future. But I think all of us have chosen to visit or live here, and it would all behoove us to, I think, be mindful of the story, like how we talk about the city and its people, because I think we're fighting against this sort of like generation deep kind of storytelling that doesn't always benefit, I think, both the city and the people. So that was sort of like a mouth dump for you guys about this. But I'm very interested in what other people are experiencing here and what you find to be compelling or maddening. And but what I see is over the last 15 years is a lot of change, just at a different pace than you might see change in London or New York or wherever, and I think that's okay.
Faster or slower?
No, I mean, for a while it was much slower, and now I think it's getting faster. Now I want everyone to just slow down, but I think it's just whatever. It's we love to compare, and I think that's the problem. And so when people compare neighborhoods and everything is the next Brooklyn, and why are we doing this? And that's what I would say. Maybe hesitate or just stop a minute before you compare things in the city, because I think the context is different, the historical implications are different, and I think we can tell better stories about Paris.
So you're telling them?
Well, there are many others, but I think also one of the reasons I did books that were also very visual was so that it didn't, because many of the topics are serious, or I address things that are more, even in the first book I go pretty in depth on why coffee has been terrible and like historically. So you might say, well, that's a book that you would generally see without images, but I think that getting toward people or reaching people sometimes requires going into a different format. People could read the New York Times all the time and get all of their stories about a place from that, but that's a small set of, I think, the people who are interested in Paris. And if you want to reach them, maybe there's other ways to tell these stories. It's like one of the women in the book who has a podcast called La Poudre. And one of the things she said to me, which I found so fascinating, and it's exactly sort of this idea, is that she chose a name that sounded quite light and cosmetic, maybe, or superficial, right? La Poudre is powder. Could make you think of maybe cocaine, I don't know. Or maybe makeup, whatever your association is. But actually, it's a way to sort of get people who wouldn't listen to a podcast if it was like feminist today, and she gets, young women especially who are from maybe super privileged backgrounds who wouldn't have considered, engaging in these topics, and she gets them in because the package is not, beating you over the head with, some super militant message. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're trying to pass certain ideas or change the way people think. Sometimes it can happen in aesthetic ways. And it doesn't have to be a report on Politico.com or, whatever. And so I thought that
But
was
that's so French, to be indirect.
to be what,
Yes.
to package things?
It's just so French not to be in your face, to be underground, as in résistance.
Yeah, that's,
I mean,
you're right.
that is
That's
their
true.
methodology.
Yeah.
They're not confrontational.
Well, then
they're
she's a
always going to
resistant.
go exactly.
She's-
They're always going to go underground like that, right? So it's a way of backdoor.
Yeah, because also you risk losing people. When you I know from talking to a climate foundation that they have these statistics on what happens to people when they're reading stories about the changing climate, and if it's in traditional media and it's all negative and there are no sort of proposed solutions, you lose people. They just stop reading it. They click away. There are other ways to get them, and not in ways that it's not like sneaky. It's really just, okay, well, how do you package these stories, these serious issues, in a way that are more likely to reach people? And that's the same kind of idea. So hopefully, it gives people something to think about.
So what do you think is your bottom line message with this book? Like, what do you want the reader to walk away with?
I want people to think about the way we talk, they talk about women and the way they see other women in this city. And when you're consuming something like Emily in Paris, I mean, the reason I was also so worked up about it was because I
we
think
all
it is
got
not,
worked up.
it's not that innocent. People, yes, in 2020 when it came out, like, okay, everyone was stuck at home, it was entertainment. But there's a lot of reductive messages in that show. How it paints American women, how it paints the French population, a very narrow slice of the French population. And I think, again, people want to just say, oh, but it's frivolous entertainment. Yeah, but this is the most visited city in the world. And
Actually, London is now.
did it get reach
London
number one?
London beat Paris recently.
Well, one of the top two.
But we'll be back. We'll be back. I'm not worried.
Well, they were the most visited in 2022 in the summer. I mean, I'm sure all of you knew at least 10 people who were gallivanting around France and Italy. But it actually does harm. So every time we think like, oh, it's not that big a deal, I think just question, who's being left out of these stories actually? And could they have make it a fantasy? Fine. I don't care if the plot is terrible and isn't realistic, but at least show a better slice of the city and how people actually function. Just so that it doesn't put forward this image that we've already seen time and time again of Paris that I think really ruins people's expectations. I mean, we all know about the Paris syndrome with the Japanese travelers who come and literally fall into, they get depressed and they need therapy while they're here. So it's because the representations of Paris in the Japanese media is very much this romanticized, polished fantasy, and then they come and it's,
And then the
or
reality
they take
hits.
the RER and they're like, what is this? And they just
Or they get hit by a scooter.
or they're treated badly, or someone's mean to, and it just is utter psychological tension, and they need help. So they're actually like psychologists standing by. I don't know if right now because
but it was a thing.
Yes. So you see what happens when it seems so unimportant, but actually this is also people's livelihoods. You're painting a picture of Paris. I don't know. I just think there's an element of humanity involved, whether it's Paris or Istanbul or New York, whatever. Just think about the way. I want people to think about the way we're perceiving the people who live here, who try to do things here, try to create, try to have a life here, and how we talk about them. And talk about them might mean in magazines, it might be, when you're making recommendations to your friends, or it might be on TV. I just think there's so many wonderfully dynamic things about this city that we often don't see. And maybe one of the few people to have really shown them was Anthony Bourdain when he did his show, because he was always someone who got under the surface and wanted to go where none of the other publications were going or highlighting. And I think that's the kind of thing we need more of, because this city is interesting for more than just, Saint-Germain-en-Marais and, the waiters who are going to be rude to you, which might actually be kind of charming to some people, but,
There's a waiter at Charlot that waits on me every single day, and he's so proud of the fact that he's a caustic waiter.
Yeah, it's just part of their DNA, their identity.
He actually is creating that image on purpose. It's so hilarious. I mean,
But you keep going, so they're okay with it.
I just laugh. I go, okay, if you're, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a place for all of this, right? Sometimes you want the crummy espresso because it's part of the experience.
Part of the charm.
But if you actually want quality things, you go deeper. But all that to say, I just think, we can tell different and maybe more profound stories.
Lindsey, who do you consume on social media to kind of keep your horizons open and kind of keep on top of this narrative that we shall be?
So that's did everybody hear that question?
No.
She asked,
repeat it for the recording.
Oh, right, it'll be on the
Yeah.
recording. Okay, I'll repeat it for the recording too.
Yeah.
So who do I consume or who do I follow on social media to help make sure I'm, being exposed to everything going on here? And I would say a lot of French media, but media as in individuals, sorry, not or activists, or some very good journalists. Not all, obviously, we all know not every journalist is created equal, but there are some who I think are, and of course, you're going to maybe ask who, and then I'm going to have a mind blank. But if I look through who I follow, I'm really trying to stay challenged. Also, people who may be a little bit more radical than I find myself to be, but who I appreciate, because it allows me to question what I think I know and understand about this city, especially like if we take the retirement discussion that we're having now. I'm very much, I've gone back on my initial thinking on that after reading a lot of people's perspectives. Some people in politics as well, who can drill into sort of like who this is going to really be impacting with great force and impact negatively, this sort of thing. So just following people who might not match my I don't want to say my politics, but more like my level of engagement on certain issues, but who I'm prepared to allow myself to be challenged by. And I think that it's good. And in the end, if I don't agree with them, that's okay. But I don't want to fall into this trap of just, no, the way I think and believe in my little bubble is the echo chamber. Yeah, I want to be careful of that, because we saw how much good that did in America.
Do you have any names in particular?
Well, so yeah, that's where I follow certain podcasts, of course. There are certain journalists who I think are really good, even at drilling into analyzing pop culture. So Jennifer Padjemi is a journalist I really love, who's done a couple of books. She posts mostly in French, but she'll dissect elements of pop culture, why certain TV shows or movies won't find the same success in France for XYZ reason. She wrote a book called Pop Culture Feminism, which looks at women through pop culture and media and movies and so forth. And she has a very good eye and deep sort of reservoir of knowledge on American, English, and French TV and movies. So when she comments, it's always sort of like a deeper layer. And I find it interesting. I've learned a lot, whether it's about a film and its impact, and I didn't see it this way, but she'll comment on other big themes, people are talking about Rihanna at the Super Bowl, right? Okay, and she'd be someone who will comment on that, but from a French perspective, and through the lens of a feminist woman of color who loves the arts and music, and will have her own interpretation. And I think I enjoy what she covers. Similarly, I do appreciate Lauren Bastide and the women who are at La Fondation des Femmes and La Maison des Femmes. So La Maison des Femmes is created by one of the women in the book, who's a gynecologist who started this sort of family justice center in Saint-Denis, where women can go if they've been victims of incest or have never seen a doctor or have, are being abused and have nowhere to go. But anyway, it's an important space for women in and around Saint-Denis, and it's been replicated elsewhere in France and in Belgium. So her work in highlighting also sort of violence against women or injustices against women, and single mothers, women trying to find their way, in precarious situations, that has been illuminating. And La Fondation des Femmes is looking at all sorts of issues for women in France. So that could be violence, that could be rights, that could be equality. But then, there are people I follow in food who I think are really interesting and have insightful commentary. Again, what I would suggest is if you look on my Instagram at who I follow, sometimes that's easier, only because I'm gonna forget a handful of people. But I think it's more just this is something I realized even during the American elections, the first time and then this recent time. Who you follow matters, right? Because you can say, I didn't know about X, Y, and Z, but sometimes it takes following one or two people who are slightly out of your comfort zone, or just slightly, who talk about issues that you generally would reserve for newspapers or magazines, and it might introduce, some new thinking. So the echo chamber is the thing that I really try to be careful of, because, and it pains me. I try not to follow people on the, the extreme right in this country. But I do want to know what they're saying. But I don't follow them. I check them out. I don't follow them.
Right.
On Twitter, it's easier because people will share and comment more easily, so I don't have to follow them, because the people I follow are already looking and watching for things they can dissect. But whatever it takes, whatever people need to do to, get beneath the surface, that's sort of what I try to do. But great question. Thank you for that, because it's easier than people think it is to just be exposed to more stuff.
But we're bombarded by so much.
I know. Well, so then it's about curation at that
Yeah,
point
you have
too.
to edit.
You
have to understand how to edit it out.
Maybe
Right.
that brand you follow isn't the best use of your eyeballs. I don't know. I'm in that process too of thinking do I need to follow every shop I really like in this city? Maybe not.
I have a question. Did you follow for those of you who are originally from the States, the kerfuffle that happened with Trevor Noah?
And
when he about the World
the World Cup, yeah.
And he said these French players aren't French. They're all black from Africa. They're not really French if they're black. So
which wasn't really what he was saying, but yeah.
What is your take on that?
Well, the then ambassador of to France in the U.S. Had a scathing response. We're all equal under the Republic. You can't say that. But actually, first of all, let's ask the players themselves. They're the ones who can choose who they're excited. All of them, I think, said, we're French, but we're also happy to be Senegalese or Moroccan or whatever, right? But in France, the context is it's universalist. You're first French, then then other things, and so therefore, someone like the ambassador, of course, is going to defend this idea that no, the players are French. They are French. We don't do what the Americans do, which is wear all of our identities as sort of like an accessory. But really, this gets into sort of what is almost legal and not legal, right? So the French don't take any census data on ethnicity and religion, because it's after World War II, there was this idea that we're in danger of this happening again if we go down that road. But the other problem in not having any sort of metrics is that there's no measurement for the discrimination that exists. So for someone to say, yes, I'm French, but I'm also proud to be from Cameroon or whatever.
I was just going to say, when I first came here, one of the things I heard repeatedly was that France didn't have hyphenates.
Yes, right.
Like in America, you're African American, you're French American, whatever. But they have we're French.
Right. And that's an excellent point. And I think that what Trevor Noah is responding to is, who cares if if the player wants to say, I'm proud to be Moroccan, but also born in France and proud of my French heritage, let them do it. But he was sort of snarkily attacking this idea that, no, they're French first. But he was also saying, in the end, isn't it also kind of a win for the cultures that they come from? because that's so great that makes up the French population. But that's not how the French view
Well, they don't want
their
to.
makeup, right? So,
Didn't one of the players reply that we're all French when we score goals and we're winning?
and then when
And then
we're
he said,
not,
when we're not,
That's
we're
right.
from
Reduce-
Cameroon or
yes.
we're from,
exactly,
yeah.
yes, that's exactly how it
Yeah,
played
that's
out. So,
exactly
and we just
how
saw,
the
and we
mentality
just
is.
saw that again with the recent World Cup, because that one, the Trevor Noah thing was from 2018. But it, you know, it happens every time.
That's like Andy Murray. When he wins, he's UK. When he loses, he's Scot. Same deal.
I mean, like the discrimination exists, but what I am happy about is that conversation blew up and it was global, and you know, I think in a way that maybe 10 years ago people weren't having these conversations on Instagram or Twitter, and it wouldn't have gone quite so viral. You would have had to maybe read about it in a column in the New York Times. Now it's quick to get out there, and I think that's good.
But I think this is also common all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'll have the same thing in the States where they're all about the baseball team or the NBA team, and then when that team's losing, oh, well, he's from China, he's not American.
It's just very easy to fall into that trap, and so the French are not to generalize, but when that happens, it's like, okay, so that's okay for you, but not for them to describe themselves in whatever way they want. Mm-hmm. But the universalism issue comes up a lot with women in the book too, because it is something that's very particular to France. And so when people don't understand, like, well, why is there this tension that exists in a different way than the racism and discrimination might exist in other countries, especially in the US? We're dealing with something else on a federal level, with the way that what does it mean to be fundamentally French as it's written in the Constitution, challenges the idea of wanting to proudly wear multiple identities, right? They also don't want you to say, you know, if you were to start, you know, identifying yourself as, I don't know, like a lesbian woman, they wouldn't want that either. Like the being in a group and isolating yourself in a group other than being French is sort of part of the problem. Anyway, that was
No, I think that's
heavy.
a different cultural difference of France versus, say, the United States, which is, you know, an immigrant country. So we're like, well, there's so much problems with discrimination and racism and things like that there, but we have these hyphenated names, to your point, and celebrate the differences. Where here, you come here and you're French. Like it's just a very cultural, different way of approaching.
But there's also a dark side to that. I'm sorry, I'm coming in from way here in the corner.
Yay!
You know, there's also an intolerance for, you know, being Muslim, and intolerance for being Jewish. I mean, like, it's great, like, you're going to be French, but, like, to your point, and I can tell you were sort of leaning there, the upside of that is we're all French. The dark side of that is, yeah, you know, when things are good.
Yeah.
Right, but, you know, you see, like, for example, Charlie Hebdo says whatever the heck they want, and they don't care who they crush as long as they're, you know, it's not, you know, there is so much overt intolerance for the differences.
Mhm.
And it's the differences. What's great about the work that you're doing is, especially like the women you highlighted and some of the new France, it's not just French stuff. It's ideal that the French should innovate on their own culture and their own ideas. But what's happening is, and what you've actually documented in a great way, is this is also a melting pot, for use of a cliche. And what's making the new France great is this influences of cultures. And in fact, the old France was an influence of cultures.
Yeah, they conveniently leave that out of the messaging.
Well, they just don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think there's a big fear in France.
Excuse me, could he speak up?
I'll repeat what he says.
I mean, this is a continent that has seen, you know, I don't know how many of you have been to other parts of here, but you know, I think the French worry about the Balkanization of their country. I spent some time in Kosovo in 2000. You're talking about a part of the world where you have a lot of people from different backgrounds pushed into a tight spot, and none of them really cared to get along with each other. And the moment a strong leader passed away, that country broke up into a million pieces, and they all started fighting. You have the United Kingdom, which quite frankly is not united.
Oh, no.
And
At
I
all.
can see, I can see in 20 years, Scotland and Northern Ireland, maybe even Wales, deciding that, you know, we want to be in the EU and you English, you know, have a nice day.
Right.
I think the French see those kind of things, and they want
Protect.
They want France.
Right.
They don't want to be broken up into individual.
What he was saying was that he thinks that France fears the sort of Balkanization of France, which is he spent time in Kosovo, and you know, when you think about those parts of the world that end up, you know, as soon as a leader is no longer in power and, you know, no one wants to get along, there are all these cultures mixing together and don't get along, and then they break off and then everything separates. I think the other thing, that the challenge maybe to that point, is that with migration, some of which is motivated by climate change at this point, like the way movement is going to keep happening, I don't think it's even realistic anymore to think that what France was can forever, and like anywhere in Europe or in other parts of the world, right? Because you have this movement, people are going to be displaced, where are they going to go? So by default, I mean, maybe what you're describing could happen regardless, but I feel like it's almost like even if that's what they want to prevent, how can they stop what's happening on a global level in terms of human displacement? I just wonder, is there a solution? Yes, it's a small country, but like, how do they, I don't know. But interesting point, I've never heard it framed in that way. Really interesting, I hadn't.
I think we've witnessed rapid changes, especially on the cultural side, in clothing and food, and the influence of immigrants. From my point of view, the most effective barrier the French have used to avoid change is the administrative structure, so Byzantine, and the judicial system,
Oh yeah.
which allows the appeal of every single case, and it's like David Copperfield with a case going for 50 years.
You're right.
So I wonder whether any of the change that you're talking about, whether the French have any desire to make any changes on the administrative and the judicial system.
Don't think so.
No.
I did so I have a podcast that basically is a continuation of all these topics and conversations, and I had on a woman who runs Soul Food, which is a nonprofit where she works with migrant youth who are basically in sort of like a holding pattern. They're not yet able to, they don't yet have their paperwork. Technically they're not allowed to work or go to school, but she's able to get them involved in certain cultural activities and sometimes do little internships so that they can, you know, really try to connect with the culture. And she said that often, and again, anybody who does sort of immigration stuff will tell you that there's really no culture or country that does it great. No one has a great reputation. So keep that in mind, but that the French tend to drag out, like you're talking about, so long some of the paperwork, so that by the time these migrants get some of their paperwork, they're now over 18, then they can't connect with their family. So there are all sorts of things that are granted if you're underage, so if you're, you know, not yet a major, what did we say, a major?
Adult.
Just an adult. Okay.
Emancipated.
Right. And so they intentionally make things, you know, keep them in this holding pattern so that, oh, now you're 18, now you're 19, and now it's going to be even more complicated. So they sort of wither for years and years. And, you know, just to say that, yes, that administrative thing, even if you're coming because you're, you know, you want to start a business, whatever. I mean, the barrier, the administrative barrier is, yes, and no joke.
No.
I mean, I think we're all immigrants ourselves.
Oh yeah, I don't call
sure,
myself.
we're all immigrants.
I struggle when people talk about expats, because I think that if any of us are here for the amount of time that we've been here or plan to be here, we're immigrants too.
Of course we are.
And the expat word is more for people, well,
We just don't look like the immigrants that they don't want.
well, except that,
That's the thing.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, immigrants and expats is used very
interchangeably, right?
race-based.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you know, white people. Sorry, I know we're all
Yeah, that's okay.
but you know, they
Tell it
tend
like
to
it
call
is.
them expats.
Yeah.
And if you happen to not be white, you're called an immigrant.
Or you're from the U.S. and so by default you come with some sort of a cachet that
The golden passport, they call it at the prefecture.
Except no one sees your nationality when you cross the street.
Right.
So,
Right.
Yeah.
But the word expatriate was really meant that there's a specific amount of time that you're in a place and then you go home. The idea is not that you stay forever, and so but the word gets used so anyway.
But with us who come here, sorry, I'm talking so much, but it's so interesting. Thank you. Do we try to assimilate as much as we can, or is it okay that we're also proudly to be American or British or Senegalese or whatever? It's a fine line to also respect the culture of traditions of the country we've come to.
I think that's a bigger question. But all of us in this room, I think, are people who respect the local culture, and we're not going to go against the grain to, why would we be here otherwise, The people who have a real difficulty, like especially Americans, they end up leaving if they can't.
Very few.
Yeah, but I know. Very few leave?
Very few leave.
I think.
Very few.
I wonder if there's.
I can count them all. Everyone I know who's left is on one hand.
Really?
Yeah.
What was that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying, I find that more retired people will stay, but I have a spate of young women girlfriends who couldn't hack the work environment, the vibe,
Yeah.
and all left.
Yeah.
Like we're crushed by it and left.
Yeah.
It's very crushing. I live in New York, and there's a lot of transient going through. They try it out, and it's too much of a change.
They try out New York or they try out Paris?
New York.
Yeah.
Same story in New York.
Yeah, you're right. It is a similar, in that sense, it's a very similar, it can be transient and, it either eats you up or.
Yeah, but for the young, it's true. For the young, it's so impossible to actually, maybe not impossible, but very difficult to really, find your path here.
Right. No.
Very
and that's
difficult.
where you create something of your own,
Right.
for sure. You had a question or a comment?
Maybe a combination, I'm not sure. I was thinking about colonization. So what is French when you consider all the colonization that went on, and now those people who live there want to come here, and they're met with they're not really French or
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah.
So, but it's always a political issue.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the things that comes up too. It's you can't avoid that question. But for a long time, France didn't want to talk about that, and they even. I know from I don't have kids, but I'm sure those of you who do or know people who have kids know that the sort of colonialization lesson in school is not really taught in the way that it should be. They don't look at it as though that they had slavery. They say, well, it was how do they refer to it? Things about like they were enriching.
It was an equal exchange.
Right. Or
we gave them roof and
exactly.
food.
So, and that today is still part of the way that they're teaching that history. So we're not. There hasn't been a real, reconciliation with that time.
Yeah, but you don't have the reversal
No.
on here that we're experiencing.
No, that's true.
I come from Florida.
Oh, God.
Why do you think I'm moving here in December?
Yeah.
But that also goes back
Banning
to
all the historic books.
conversation about, do we assimilate, do we become proud American, proud Brit? Living in Florida, it's not necessarily the country, but it's the change of states. And as a born-bred native Floridian, nothing drives me crazier than to have the New Yorker or the Cincinnati or the Michigander who comes down and complains about the city and everything's great back there. So I think you have to, if you're going to live anywhere else that isn't your original home, your birthplace where you grew up, you have to find some assimilation as well as be prepared to help teach people about where you came and some of your own traditions.
Yeah.
Because that idea of coming in and just putting down everything, or maybe not putting down, but promoting where you came from to the highest,
Right.
can really rub people wrong in all cultures.
Yeah, I hope we don't see the reversal that you're describing in the U.S. I hope we don't get to that point here, but it is, it is.
Question.
Yeah.
COVID has changed everything in the world we're never going back. I wonder how you think COVID has changed Parisian life and Parisian way of thinking.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because if you ask people who have restaurants, they say there are a lot of people who don't want to work anymore.
Very hard to find personnel.
Yeah, they left the industry.
Same thing is
That's
true in the States.
yes, absolutely. So it's a commentary also about a system that maybe wasn't that sustainable to begin with, that we've been sort of upholding for all this time, and now the workers are like, you know what? No. But so that's sort of in crisis.
So what are they doing when they all say, I don't want to work?
Well, this is
Curious.
this is kind of the question. Some of them are on unemployment and are figuring things out. Some of them will go into other things. Some of them might be starting businesses. But I think some of them are also trying to see how far they can sort of go until money dries up, and then they need to find work again. I don't know if I can't say with any certainty that that's the majority of cases, but when you talk to restaurant owners, there seems to be this idea that some people would always do this sort of temporary work where they work for 6 months, then they take 6 months off and they collect some amount of money and then, travel or do something else, and then they go back. And so,
Well, especially if they could get supported with unemployment.
which is changing. That too has been, modified, and not in a good way for. They're trying to cut down on abuses, but I think the other thing is that people are leaving Paris. Le Parisien just did a story on people leaving the
huge.
city, which is also cyclical, but right now there seems to be a frustration with whether it's cost, whether it's, all
Traffic.
the construction, people want more nature. So certainly there's been, like a prise de conscience, and people want maybe different kinds of environments.
We've seen young and old French people wearing masks.
Yeah,
in
yeah,
subways
yeah.
still. Last year when we were here, even the French modified how often they would walk the streets and go out in the middle of the COVID. So
I think.
And I don't know about working, going to work versus work at home. But what I can say is it seems like lunch is. The cultural habit of having lunch has not changed.
No, people are definitely back to lunch. That's for sure. No, you bring up interesting questions. I think many of us thought that globally this was going to be a real a game changer, and that people would not return to certain behaviors. And now we're starting to see even companies backtrack and say, no, actually we want you back in the office, and that maybe the remote work thing is going to be, lesser than anticipated, and not as frequent. But
We're like there's a Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. The only thing guaranteed in life going forward is change.
Right.
And sometimes you live in a period where you don't see as much change as others. We live in an era now that COVID has changed things. I'm towards the end of my career, but the company that I work for, they shut down their corporate offices in 2020. We've never reopened them. They figured out that life can go on, business can go on, and it's not just France; it's everywhere. Everyone is in flux right now, and it will, at some point settle, and we'll technology is allowing for a lot of different, things like restaurant work, things like that. That's always going to sort of shake out and be, at some point, settle in. COVID is, we're all going to figure out at some point that COVID is something that it's an endemic, not a pandemic. It's like, you're going to get your COVID shot along with your flu shot every year. And hopefully we'll just wait until the next major virus to come down the road. But it'll be something we learn to live with, because that's just what we do. It's an evolving society. So, but we're not at the end. We're sort of at the end of the beginning of that COVID phase. And
it's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
But also it's now triggered the work change phase, and that's going to be ongoing for a while. Fortunately for me, I won't have to participate.
Lucky. Yeah. Well, I guess to be determined how it all shakes out, right? I think that's true. We haven't seen all of the changes yet, so.
Lindsey, what do you think about the idea of laïcité? This
Oh
is a
boy,
favorite,
really?
this is
Oh,
a favorite
gosh.
subject of mine.
Wow, you really wanted to add a
Sorry.
zinger. What do I think about laïcité, which is France's version? You know, I say France's version of secularism because
Yeah,
it's not.
it is France's version of
It's not. You can't just say it's separation of church and state.
No.
I think it's great in theory. Truly, it is not working, or it's not. It's the government. I think abuses it.
I think the French in total abuse it, or they use it as a disguise for racism.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
So,
I'm glad I'm not the only one who thinks that.
No. So that's one of the themes that I had to break down in the book because it comes up so often, and you know, my editor was like, I think it's good that you're going to do a primer because some of these themes you can't just casually mention laïcité and expect people to understand. And if you call it secularism, well, it's not really that either. So it's sort of this, again, I think, unfortunately, it has very good foundation, kind of like the idea of universalism. Yeah, in theory, it sounds really great,
right?
But in practice, it's not functioning the way it should, and people are discriminated against constantly.
Clearly. I mean, it's kind of like when Marine Le Pen, during the debate, actually stated that she would outlaw headscarves, women's wearing headscarves. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Period. Like, really? You know.
So I think that's another thing. I mean, France is like, I think what is a bit not slow, but certainly, you know, full of inertia is progress on these issues. We're talking about them a lot, but there's maybe not yet enough movement. And I think, you know, look, as people like to say when we talk about the retirement issue and the reason people are protesting, because keep in mind, almost 70% of French people disagree with the reform. So every right that the French have, they fought for. It, you know, it's not just that the government is super altruistic and like gave them the social benefits that they have. And I think we have to think about, you know, in improving some of these issues, it's going to take more fighting and more protesting and more.
But what percentage of the country is actually more self-employed, for example? When you look at that compared to the 70% who disagree with the reform.
Right, that's a question.
Right?
I don't know. That's where we need more information. Absolutely. I know.
Because I had an interesting conversation with actually one of my business partners who we talked about how the socialists love to promote that in spite of the 35-hour work week, France is one of the most productive countries on the planet. But they don't count the numbers of people who don't work, who work twice that 35 hours, who work 70 hours, who make up for what the others are not doing. That did not make the news.
Well, the other thing is all of these statistics and these reports, you have to take them all with a grain of salt because you don't know what they're not measuring.
What their message, yeah.
So, yeah. Fair enough.
I'm kind of now after this deep discussion, my question is going to sound like such a fluff question. But so, I'm definitely with you in terms of like my brain is also, it's sort of between yours and like the fluff, meaning like the typical Parisian, because I live in the 11th like you. I always write about like the real Paris and all that, and my agent is not interested in anything I'm proposing that would be off, you know, that dream of
I
Paris.
know.
It's very hard. She's been trying to get me to do.
They want Emily.
It's really sick.
Get me to do like a Paris lifestyle kind of book, which I hate doing, and it all comes off so trite. So I really appreciate that you've actually been able to make.
Well, what I will tell you is that even with the first one, I had mostly no's and one yes.
Yeah. And it's so smart. And the thing I wanted to ask you, because it is like the new Paris, what do you think about this resurgence, especially embraced by young people, of the routier and the bouillon? There's something really old.
Oh yeah.
Back, and
These formats, these restaurant formats, the routier are basically like road truck stops, but like slightly better, where you can eat quite cheaply. And the bouillon, which was an old format meant for people to have a quick lunch during, you know, the work hour.
It's like fast food, the beginning of fast food in a way.
Yeah.
But in these gorgeous sort of Art Nouveau
Yep.
halls. So, but it's like old, but it's really hot and new, and the young people are embracing it. What do you think about that?
I think it's it's cyclical because when the new Paris came out, we were starting to see the premise of the return of like the good bistro. Daniel Rose did the La Bourse et la Vie, and we had some of these coming back that were doing like quality with good ingredients, and now it's just sort of like exploding. And I feel like Paris seems to do this thing where they go out of, it'll be super experimental and out of left field, and then that gets to be too much, and then they go back towards sort of the center, more familiar. And given everything we've gone through in the last 5 years, I think it's normal that there's this shift back toward familiar and comforting, and I'm sure we're gonna see other things develop.
Yeah.
But I think it has a permanent place.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when the bistros were starting to go, and the brasseries were starting to go out of fashion, everyone said, well, it's because young people don't want to eat that kind of food. And what we're discovering is, no, it's just they didn't want to eat it at those prices.
Oh yeah, that too, yeah.
There's like the lines outside these bouillon, which is very much that stick to your ribs kind of saucy food, and the moutier. It's all like heavy, like stuffed cabbage and sauce. People are loving it, but it's affordable.
It's affordable, but I wonder also, like, this is just like my line of questioning, my personal line of questioning is like, a lot of young people are maybe thinking of not having meat and maybe trying to avoid like the thinking of the environment. And so I wonder what's going to happen if there's sort of, because those restaurants are not like.
They're not avoiding meat.
No,
not at all.
What I love is when French culture moves forward in a way that's still inherently French, whatever that means, right? Because there's also Moroccan and whatever Algerian. But then I went to the Bouillon Petit Pharaon, and they had a stuffed poitou marron with lentils, and fully
veggie, yeah.
Unbelievable. So like that would be smart. To your point, okay, well, so evolve so you can become a part of the fabric of the new.
Well, I mean, the whole reason that those places existed were because too many people couldn't afford to eat, bigger meals or more expensive meals, especially not during the workday. And so here we are again, and didn't have kitchens. So here we are again, needing these establishments. I hope they can keep. I mean, because they do such high volume, in theory, they can keep it going even with inflation. But other questions to.
Yeah.
Why people are going toward them now might be different than what, was motivating people before. So it's super interesting how the role of these establishments changes.
Fascinated by that comeback of it.
It's hard. Just to her point about, the foreign audience being sometimes reluctant to take a chance. That's part of the reason we don't see more stories that are a little bit more, not out of left field, but trying to go against the grain in terms of the recurring story.
Yeah,
they're just afraid of a flop.
Well, they also don't want to ruin those rosy-colored glasses viewpoint.
But it's also because the editors themselves don't.
It's called sales.
Right.
It's called sales.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's very disheartening
We can't sell a
too.
book that's the truth.
Except you can.
Well, you can, yes, but that's.
But
what
they don't.
think.
They're still very risk averse. Mm-hmm. So, TBD. Keep going though. Keep trying.
Yeah, keep trying.
I had a comment about your earlier comments regarding the Olympics in 2024.
Oh yeah.
I lived in LA in 1984, and the first words out of my mouth was, "I'm out of Dodge," when that comes up. I didn't leave. I've never seen LA more beautiful, more functional than 1984 during the Olympics.
Oh gosh, I hope.
It was spectacular.
I really hope that happens here.
The same thing happens.
That's because so many people will leave, okay, that the city will actually be available for the tourists.
People didn't leave. They had huge turnouts for all the events, but they controlled the traffic, they controlled the transportation. They had flags flying everything looked beautiful, and it was functional. You said you could do it now, why can't you do it all the time, right?
Well, as long as they do things better than the Liverpool game from this summer. Does anyone remember that?
And Madrid. Yeah, that was terrible.
Oh yeah.
It was basically there were all these supporters who came out for this Liverpool PSG game, right? It was PSG.
Real Madrid.
Okay. But it happened at Stade de France.
It did.
Okay, and supposedly the cops felt that there were too many people who didn't have tickets who were in line. So what they did was they basically gassed everybody. to get them out because they were trying to manage flow, but they were not managing flow. And so then, women and children who were in line with tickets saying, we have tickets. Also, they're foreign, so they're like, can't speak to these cops in French, and they're getting tear gassed. It was
horrible.
a spectacle.
What a scandal.
Right.
against
So
the French,
so that
yeah.
was not a good indication that they're prepared for anything, but I'm hoping they're, doing trainings and
Taking away all the driving lanes and making bike lanes. It's going to be very hard to have that.
no, it's gonna be an interesting
No, they're using a lot of. I happen to know about this because I work for them, but
good, okay.
Yeah.
they're using a lot of
Reassure us.
sites. They're using a lot of existing sites in Paris. They're not really building just a few stadiums, so that's going to be interesting. So how they're going to deal with it is they're just going to shut down major roadways and open them up for cars. No bikes can go, no whatever. So it will be difficult to get around the city, and just know that now. The tickets
I'm
are all
leaving.
digital, so they're hoping that that's going to be a way to prevent that same problem. Because what happened with the Liverpool game, there were a lot of printed out fake tickets. So it's purely digital tickets, which will be interesting if somebody's phone died.
Well, they'll have an opportunity to see how good they are because this fall is the World Rugby Cup in Paris.
Oh, geez, wow.
The World
One
Rugby
thing
Cup.
after the other.
It's a
With the
test.
worst of spectators.
Oh, spectators.
Right.
Well, good. Now we have something to get excited for later this year. See how crazy it gets.
Oh my goodness. So I have another loaded question.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
bring them on. Bring 'em on.
What do you think of Anne Hidalgo?
Turn off the camera.
I respect her. I think we needed to push through a lot of these changes. I think some of them could have been done maybe a little bit more thoughtfully to ease the growing pains or the adaptation phase, or have at least come up with alternatives while things are, completely a mess, to have sort of an alternative way for people to get around. I think it's often ripping a Band-Aid when actually you need to sort of go a bit slower or have other, contingency plans in place. And I don't know. I can't see Paris being under control of a right-winger, regardless. I just think this city needs someone who has a social foundation and is going. But I don't know. That's all I'll say really, because I think am I like her biggest fan? I'm not a big fan of anybody in any government.
Yeah.
But I think she has been good for the city in a lot of ways, and there are areas where there were some decisions that were not so good. But I see that as being sort of part and parcel of the parameters of her job. She's not going to be able to do everything. I really wish they would, and this is not just a mayoral problem, this is a regional problem and even a Macron problem, the way that they're not handling the drug, la colline du crack, and the way that they haven't handled the drug issues and severe homelessness, and what they do with the immigrant camps or the migrant camps is just
Perry Poubelle.
I mean, it's just horrific. So there are things
Harry
that,
Poubelle?
but people often mistake like what falls within her jurisdiction and what is actually more of the region and more of a sort of a federal needs federal input and action. And I think that's unfortunate. It falls on her, and people just assume like it's because of you that all of this is,
Oh, I blame her for everything.
I'm sorry, you're not living in Paris anymore, but what is the homelessness situation here? Because I'm from
Not
Los
good.
Angeles.
Not good. Oh, it's not as bad as LA.
Okay.
No, but it's not great.
No.
Oh, so it is an issue because I've
Yeah.
seen
Oh yeah, it's gotten worse
Oh,
since
yeah.
Is there
COVID.
anywhere that is?
Right. No.
I mean,
But I was in where
it's all over the U.S.
It tripled.
Right,
It
right.
tripled in Los Angeles.
Oh yeah, LA
Tripled
is,
in Los Angeles during the
the
time
whole
of
West
COVID.
Coast is
Yeah.
catastrophic.
Northern Seattle.
And so people from my hometown are calling me like, "What's it like in France?" And of course, I live in the Loire Valley, so I live in the French countryside. And I'm like, "It's so great, we have social systems here." But I could be dead wrong. I mean,
It's a bigger issue than just like, yeah, of course there are places where they can go, but if they don't, I think it's less my issue is more not on the homelessness issue, which is obviously something to address, but really the way they treat people who have addiction. And sort of how they've handled that, and they just keep pushing people out further out, but no one is getting it seems like no one is getting treatment or help or whatever. And so then, what do you do? What do you do, essentially?
Don't they have a group that goes around and visits with a lot of?
They do, but those are, I think they're nonprofits, right? That do those.
They try
Yeah.
and talk them off the street to do things. And I've read where a lot of those people absolutely refuse to leave the street.
Yeah, it's challenging.
A lot of homelessness is mental issues
Yeah.
and
Shame.
addiction and shame,
Yeah.
and the families kicked them out and they have nowhere to. It's a bigger thing than just, can I get a job? Do I have money in my pocket? And I don't know here in France, but certainly in the States, it's having that help from the government to provide mental health services
Right.
and health services and stuff to people who need it. Instead, we've cut it over the decades and kind of tried to shove them out of the view
Right.
instead of seeing them. I mean, we've walked the streets quite a bit since we've been here, and I've seen a number of people homeless. I've seen them camped out in the doorways. I've seen where it's obvious they've made this their home.
Yep.
Found a rubber mattress and so forth. I see it when I walk in my own little town of 2 square miles in South Florida.
Right.
They're doing the same thing there. It's a bigger caring of people more than just, we're social here, so therefore we provide these services. We got to go deeper.
Right.
It can't all be up to the nonprofits.
No,
But
no.
it's also not just mental, that is a big part of it, but it's also not understanding where these homeless people are coming from. For example, a lot of them have their own personal belongings with them, and they have a dog. And to go into a shelter, you can't bring your dog, and your stuff's gonna get stolen. So why would somebody choose to go into a homeless shelter when they're gonna lose their dog and they're gonna lose their stuff?
Right.
So, yes, mental health is a big part of it, but also it's understanding where these people are coming from. And for example, in Seattle, they have these little tiny homes, which are perfect, but no one will let the tiny homes go anywhere. So they have tiny homes, thousand tiny homes in a warehouse, and nobody's living in them because there's no place to put them. And people would give their IT to have a little tiny place to put their stuff and their dog or their animals or whatever. It's nuts.
Yeah. No, it's a deeper. Oh yeah, definitely a deeper societal issue. And interesting, The Atlantic did a very interesting report on the particular issue in Los Angeles since COVID, and how even the progressives, the liberals, don't go up to bat and don't make the changes that need to happen. And so they're catering to people who, we don't want those people living in our neighborhood.
The NIMBYs are
The what?
NIMBYs, not in my
Not in my backyard.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Yes, that.
Not in my backyard.
There's a lot of the problem because they won't let, they won't let people come in their neighborhood.
Right.
And there's a hotel that went out of business in my neighborhood, and it's perfect for people to. It's a perfect spot, and all of the neighbors are up in arms at the city council because they think there's going to be drugs, they think there's going to be killings, there's going to be all this kind of stuff, and these are people that just want to have a roof over their head.
Right. Well, and that's where they just don't, the population don't want to, listen to the statistics about how likely those people are to be violent or to be aggressive, right? They just assume, no, they're going to be a danger.
Well, and I think the statistics actually show that most homeless people are not yes, it's a problem, but most homeless people are not mentally ill. They got kicked out of their house because the rents went too high. They got laid off. Whatever other social reasons, and they have their stuff and their dog, and they can't go to a homeless shelter because they'll take that stuff away. So they'd rather stay on the street.
I mean, these are also big city issues, right?
Yes.
So Paris is not unlike other places for sure, but.
No, true.
And I think COVID will change that too because people aren't going back to work, so moving out of the cities. The Daily, the New York Times podcast, talked about the changes cities are undergoing because of post-COVID, and they took as an example San Francisco, where it's just like deserted, no one going back into the town. So I wonder if Paris will see
I'm sure.
a change like that.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? You've got 10 more minutes.
It's
Lindsay's holding
I have
up.
a frilly question talking about La Puja. So this is like the French, sorry for the men in the room, but the female aesthetic when you talk about, oh, the French woman who's so effortlessly thin and beautiful and, you know, and no, they put a lot of effort into it. They don't, like, oh, they drink wine. Like, no, French women do not drink more than one glass of wine. They, you know, it's
Well,
like
all of it is just.
Yeah, but that's one of those French women cliches.
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
It's that whole big,
That's my
who are
point.
they? You know, who?
That's my point is that I agree with you that there's this cliche that is not, the truth is not known about what it takes for them to look that effortlessly, that.
Well,
I didn't even see that. I did not see that all the French women are thin and beautiful. And
Not at all.
No, because
not at all. Who are they?
I have never seen so much sloppy hair. They take pride in this. It's part of their thing. You know, I don't see all these graceful, beautiful.
No, when you see someone well taken care of, it's usually an American.
No, I mean there are certain neighborhoods where you're more likely to see them, but it's because of the the demographic, and they go and get their hair blown out every Wednesday morning or whatever, you know, whatever it is. But it's like I was recently in Milan for work, and you know, in certain neighborhoods, a very specific type of Italian man and woman you would see, the Milanese, like the.
Of course.
Yeah, there's again, it's not completely fabricated. These people exist, but that's just what we harp on and we put in the you know, put in the media. But actually, they're like a small subset.
I spend so much of my time walking the city. I mean, walking everywhere because I live dead center, and I can walk an hour and a half in any direction to cover a lot of the city. And I see
You see the difference.
Differences in different areas, but I have never found that beautiful, perfect French. I think.
Well, good. It's unattainable and it doesn't exist. Yeah.
It's on Emily in Paris. It must be so.
Exactly. So the myth is just being kept alive.
You just have to be in this neighborhood during Fashion Week.
But
Okay.
they're not even necessarily French. They're just
No, they're not. Oh, no, they're definitely not French.
When we were speaking about Amy Hidalgo, I found that there was a significant difference when Bertrand Delano left, because
Definitely.
the city sparkled.
That's right.
And it seems like people who came to Paris when we were touring around, and I was showing them, oh, it's just not as clean as it was the last time we were
No,
there.
it's
They were
not.
there when it was,
Right.
there was a pride.
No, there wasn't.
And you wrote about this in one of your letters.
Yeah.
And it was
I loved him.
absolutely a drastic change in the level of the poubelle in the streets.
Right.
It's not just a little bit. When you go around to some of the markets at Saint Juan.
Yep.
Oh
But
my
what is
gosh,
happening? Are they just not? They're not sending as many cleaners to certain
they're
neighborhoods.
not sending cleaners, it seems like.
It's
to
broken
certain
windows.
areas.
It's broken windows theory,
Right.
basically.
Okay.
When Delano was in office, he had this big campaign to give a prize to whoever could have the most beautiful flowering windows, for example. Well, suddenly, everybody had flower boxes. Everybody. I mean, the city
was a
just went
pride.
nuts.
Yeah.
There was a pride in it. It was really, really beautiful. And he did things like that. Now, Delano himself, when he would come into, you know, the room and do a speech, he was dressed in a black velour, double-breasted suit. I mean, he looked beautiful, okay? And he commanded a presence. Anne was his deputy mayor at the time, okay? When Anne came in to speak, and I swear this is true because I'll never forget it. Every January they have a big event at the Hotel de Ville to welcome in the city, okay? And the mayor comes and the city council's there with her. And she's a great speaker, okay? But she comes in and she's wearing a black biker jacket, okay?
Yeah.
This is the mayor of Paris,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
she's wearing a black biker jacket. And then all of the city council behind her look like they haven't even washed their hair,
Yeah.
okay? I mean, they look horrible.
Yeah.
They look like rats. Like you want to say, excuse me, you're professionals. You represent the city of Paris. Have you no pride
Yeah.
in your... And so I've witnessed this complete difference.
Window coming
yes,
down.
of doesn't matter that there's a few broken windows, okay, right? That whole idea is just been completely ignored, and I've seen this go down since she took
and it's
over.
just getting worse.
Then the city's perfect.
Right. I mean, it's like, remember when she put the urinals up on the along the Seine? I was like, this is a terrible idea. This is hideous. It's a
Exactly.
terrible
This
idea.
is really what we want, is to
they
encourage
still
men
there?
to piss on the street? I don't think so.
They're like a series of missteps, and you're
Yes.
sort of like, just stay on the other course. Don't be. I don't know what you're doing with this, but like, get the car
No, there
usage
is
down.
a difference.
Fine, but like,
big difference.
stop with these like monstrosities. I have a friend who also will never forgive her for the renovation of the magazine kiosks.
Oh, right. No,
Which-
exactly.
In their defense, it is more comfortable for the magazine, the sellers. Like they will say it's more comfortable. They have more space. There's probably AC or heating or whatever. But it's true, it lost all the charm,
Right.
and now it looks like a porta potty from the outside. So
No taste. The woman has no taste.
See, but this is what I like. I think it's like she's one of those divisive figures. I don't know. No. Just the normal magazine kiosks. Like there's one at the end of. Wait, where are we? There's one at the end of Bretagne down here. You'll see if you walk by.
Like the Parisian version of a bodega.
Right. But where they don't sell hot dogs, they just sell magazines and like gum. But
Okay, but the latest I saw was that now they're talking about, believe it or not, outlawing the electric scooters.
oh, see, I'm like
Okay.
all for the annihilation of those things.
I know, but but the city created all of these lanes, right, and all of that to encourage the use of non-pollutant vehicles, right? And now that they can't behave themselves and stop at crosswalks and lights, now they're going to get punished and be outlawed. It's like, make up your mind.
But the city doesn't do education.
Right.
Well, that's my question.
Exactly, they can't.
I've been going through.
Don't get me started.
I've been going through driving lessons.
Uh-oh.
The worst. It's a nightmare. I hate it. It's a waste of my money, but whatever. And my instructor's like, look, the reality is, because I told him I'm livid. I'm seeing people make infractions left and right. No one is stopping
No
them.
one,
No one
no.
is. And he's like, no, you'll almost never get stopped in
That's
Paris.
right. That's right.
You just won't. And then you see bikers making mistakes and not following
No one-
rules. And
no
you're
one
like, yeah, you'll
ever.
almost never. Just during COVID, they you know, on Rivoli, they stopped people for a while. But so I don't understand how this city functions at all, because they're not enforcing any kind of
No,
rule.
that's right, they
And
aren't.
if there's a policeman, it's usually 4.
Right. They're
They can't
And they're
only have
talking
one or
and
two.
smoking.
So yeah, I mean, if they were to enforce the rules of with the e-scooters, fine, but they don't, and you
that's
see
right.
people with like 3 on these things piled up, kids, they're about to kill someone.
Well, there's your issue with the e-scooters, and that's not just here in Paris. There's a big, like our little, we live in the Fort Lauderdale metropolitan area, this small town surrounded. So we don't allow those at all in our little town. So you don't. But the e-scooter versus the bicycle is a much more disposable form of
Transport.
So it's easy to just drop it and go.
Yeah.
Bicycle is not something that necessarily just gets dropped and it also allows for ease of access on the, zipping through on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
So it is a particular menace in and of itself. Different. So just because they're considering getting rid of the electric scooter doesn't mean that they've wasted all of their time making it easier for
No,
bike lanes
right.
and things like that.
I agree.
The two concepts can coexist in the same space, and this is ridiculous. We can't have all this chaos going on with these e-scooters, but we're going to have bike lanes that we're going to get under control.
Right. No, it's just a shame that no one enforces anything, and
No, they don't.
But I'm very much a get off my lawn person when it comes to the scooters. Like that's my approach. I'm like I really, because I've seen too many people get hurt.
Oh, yeah.
And then heard about these
Dangerous.
horrific accidents, and people have died, and I'm just like, if they're not going to enforce the rules, then let's like do something about this. And then maybe they'll
But
also.
they just need to enforce the rules.
Right.
And
well.
who's in charge of that? Madame.
Is she in charge of the préfecture too?
Well, you would imagine she's certainly in charge of the city police, right?
The city police, but I don't
Yeah.
think she's not the
Not the-
préfecture.
no, not the
Right, so it's the
préfecture.
préfecture that needs to enforce the. It's Pécresse. I knew it. See, she's the problem. Sorry, this is still being recorded. I'm like coming out as a Pécresse hater, but.
Oh, she already has a big dossier on me. I'm certain of it.
Oh, you mean for
Oh, I'm sure there's a big.
antagonistic
Yeah, I'm
speech
sure
about
there's
her?
a big
Yeah.
dossier in there.
She's she's a piece of work.
No, Hidalgo.
Oh, I'm talking about Pécresse.
I'm talking about Hidalgo.
Oh yeah, I'm alright with Hidalgo.
Oh yeah,
but
I'm
Pécresse,
certain of it. Uh-huh.
You're in her books.
To your point about the city and deterioration and cleanliness, in the Paris magazine, which came out this week, the big article in the front was about the new machines that they have to clean and how many more garbage people they have to pick up things, and they're promoting themselves and how well they're.
Right, but have you noticed what a bad job they're doing?
Yeah, but that's what I think is so funny, you know. So really?
Although nothing is as dirty as New York. When I was there, I was just like, this place is filthy.
Yeah, no, it's.
Yeah, San Francisco's great.
So I don't know. When people complain about Paris, I'm like, have you been to a number of other American cities?
No, New York's pretty bad. Lisa's
Also, at least we put our
Lisa's a New
trash.
Yorker.
We put our trash in trash bins.
I said, you're New Yorkers. Of course, you're defending New York.
Because I'm in both cities.
And then the rats go and eat in the bags. It's just like
You see the difference.
yes, that happens for a reason.
Paris, I lived in Paris from 2000 to 2005, and I think they collected trash at least once a day, if not twice a day. That was in the time of
De la Nuit.
It was like people were cursing the trash men in the streets, which were, slowing traffic.
See, that's the other thing. People would not be happy. They're never happy. You add more trash people, then they're going to complain about it blocking the roads.
No, because the French aren't happy. They aren't happy until they're not happy. I mean, that's the only time they're happy is when they're not happy.
But do they still collect trash here daily?
It's not fun if there's nothing to complain
Maybe it depends
about.
on the neighborhood, like the high tourist neighborhoods. But my neighborhood, it's what, twice a week? I think it gets taken out. Yeah.
Business and restaurant areas like that.
Yeah, I think so.
Am I in the way? No. Well, Lindsay, you've held up very, very well.
I know, you guys gave me energy. Thank you. I know what'll happen. I'll crash, but it's fine.
Thank you so much.
thank
Do you have
you.
any books left to sell?
I have one, but I think I've reserved it for summer here. But it is available. It's at Merci. It's at Shakespeare & Co. It's at Galignani. It's online.
Okay.
It's in the Kirkland Library, by the way.
Oh,
Both
excellent.
your books are.
Where is the Kirkland Library?
It's a suburb of Seattle. It's
Seattle.
Also, it's also in the Seattle Library.
Excellent. Yeah. No,
There you go.
oh.
Still recording.
Yes. Well, no. So yeah, no. Shakespeare & Co. The Red Wheelbarrow.
Wheelbarrow.
She carries the books. Smith & Sons.
Galignani.
Oh yeah. So
Galignani.
this is one of my favorites, Galignani, because it's French English. Yeah, across from Tuileries, the Tuileries Gardens. But the closest place that I know carries this is Merci, because it's the boutique, the concept store just over here on the boulevard, and they carry it right now.
111 Boulevard Beaumarchais.
111. That's right. It's the easiest address, but it's readily accessible.
Thank you so
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. You guys are so curious. I feel like we're just having a big chat. I love it.
Thank you all for coming. Don't forget to pay for your drinks on the way down.
Don't leave them for Adrian.